But what's amazing about free enterprise capitalism is it forces you to be a good person. Now, are there bad people in the free market? Of course there are. And too many of those cheaters sometimes get away with it, but they get called out more times than not. However, to be rich and to be successful and to attain wealth, it's really hard to be a jerk over and over and over again. It actually requires for you to be decent. It requires you to tell the truth. It requires you to employ a lot of people and earn the trust of your employees.
So what you just heard there was Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA, offering one of the most absurd defenses of capitalism that I have ever heard. And I'm trying not to be hyperbolic. I genuinely believe that. Kirk's basic argument is that under capitalism, when you succeed, it is mostly because you are a good and honorable and decent person. And that on the off chance that you find success while being unscrupulous, eventually that will catch up to you. And that the people who are wealthy and successful are wealthy and successful because they've worked hard and because they've treated people with respect and decency. That is an insane proposition. Look at the room. This is a Turning Point USA room. And when he said that, the room gave muted applause at best. Because even in the bastions of capitalism, do people not believe that BS? Capitalists don't believe what Charlie Kirk just said. History and contemporary realities point in direct contradiction to what Kirk said. Look at the history. There was a time where people honestly believed what Kirk said, the majority of society seemingly, that if capitalists were allowed to do what they will without government interference, with limited worker interference via unions, that they would more often than not do the right thing and make everyone better off in the process. And that's what's known as the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons, the early industrial revolution, where some people made immense wealth and many, many people suffered deeply during that industrial transition because there were no protections for workers. There were limited unions. There were no minimum wages. Children were often forced to work instead of attend school. There were no protections for injured workers or workers killed on the job. There were no consumer protections. There were no environmental protections. And what happened is that a few people made tremendous amounts of wealth, often on the exploitation of the masses of working people, including young children, sometimes younger than 5 years old. That was the basis of that economy. And in that economy, most of the time, you made money not by being a decent person, but by extracting surplus labor from your workers, by misleading consumers, by dominating your opponents, by destroying and defiling the environment, by practicing things like insider trading and other forms of corporate manipulation. That's how you found success, not through being a decent person. And what people eventually realized from the late 1800s into the Second World War period was that capitalism, when running amok, causes deep harm to nearly everyone in society, and that the only way to ensure a more just society is with heavy regulation on the conduct of employers and corporations to ensure better protections for workers, the environment, consumers, and communities, and on and on and on. That was the only way. Even many capitalists believe that. FDR was not a socialist. FDR was a capitalist, but FDR fundamentally believed that capitalism needed to be saved from itself. John Maynard Keynes believed much the same, that regulations were needed, macroeconomic regulations were needed, and regulations on the workplace in terms of labor law and environmental law and consumer law were needed because if those things weren't done, capitalism would destroy itself. It would destroy itself because capitalists do not operate with a moral compass. They simply don't. Capitalists that do operate with a moral compass often fail, or they exist in very, very narrow circumstances, often in an oligopolistic or monopolistic industry where they sort of have the luxury of operating with certain moral codes that smaller businesses in a more cutthroat arena do not have. And so what ends up happening is that capitalists have to find success through exploiting their workers, exploiting their consumers, exploiting their environment. And they often have to mind PR when they do that. So they have to have an image. Kirk is right in noting that if you have a bad corporate image, it can hurt you. But the goal is never to be actually good and moral. The goal is to look good and to look moral because it's good for the bottom line. It's not actually about morality. Capitalism is an amoral system at best and an immoral system at worst. Let's also look at the goals of capital. The goal of capitalism is to extract surplus labor, as I've noted. That puts you in direct contradiction to treating your workers well. Individual capitalists from time to time will talk about how they treat workers well, or some businesses will try to be less exploitative of their workers, but fundamentally, the capitalist relationship is one where the owners of capital extract surplus labor from the working people that they employ. Capitalism in that sense always has that exploitative relationship, and that can't be overcome with some nice words from Charlie Kirk. Further to all of that, there is the shareholder reality that many publicly traded corporations face. And Kirk says you have to treat your workers well. You have to be good and decent. But what about the instances, and I would say these instances are not the extreme, but the norm, where the goals of shareholders are in direct contradiction with the goals of workers and of consumers and of the environment and of the society broadly defined. In those cases, corporations are duty-bound to represent the interest of the shareholders and not the workers, and not the consumers, and not the public. And that's the reality. Capitalism in that case has clearly stated the goal here is protect your shareholders, increase their values, raise their stock price, raise their dividends, preserve their dividends, whatever. That's the goal. If you have to lay off workers, do it. If you have to exploit consumers, do it. If you have to ravage the environment in the United States and abroad, do it. If you have to mistreat workers, especially in the developing world, but even here at home, do it. Whatever it takes, you need to do it to raise that shareholder value. And if it's illegal, and in some cases it is, lie about it. Conceal your crimes. Hide your crimes. Ship your crimes abroad to jurisdictions that have weaker laws or that don't have the ability to enforce those laws because of the size and wealth of your corporation and the fact that you have the backing, implicitly even, of the U.S. state and the U.S. Army and the U.S., global capitalist infrastructure. When you have companies like Nestle saying that water is not a human right, that's not a corporation that's operating under a nice guy principle. That's not a corporate leadership that's operating as being nice and finding success. Nestle is an incredibly successful corporation, and it does so with an open air that rejects the basic human rights of people. It's open about it. It finds success nonetheless. Look, for those who know me on this channel, they know that I'm a socialist. I'm not a capitalist. I don't even support this dream, this utopian idea that you can regulate capitalism into making it decent. We need a fundamental socialist solution to build a just and humane and dignified society for everyone. But even those who believe in the potential of capitalism know what Charlie Kirk said is absolute bullshit. 100%. Because they realize that capitalists do not, will not, and in many cases cannot operate in a moral framework. They cannot do that. And because they can't do that, you need a regulated field to ensure some basic elements of human dignity are preserved. And so this idea that the free market forces people to be nice, forces people to be decent, forces people to be cooperative, couldn't be further from the truth. Rather, market capitalism does none of those things. And let's be 100% real. Let's close on this. Charlie Kirk likes to associate capitalism with free markets, to associate capitalism with individual liberty and all the values that are supposedly central to the American experience, to the Western European experience, to the experience in countries like Canada. And people will say, well, it's capitalism. Capitalism and democracy go together. Capitalism and free speech. Capitalism and free trade. Capitalism and free markets. But capitalism is actually a barrier to all of those things. Capitalism has never, ever been about the free exchange of goods. Markets existed before capitalism, and they will exist after capitalism, at least in some form. What capitalism is a system of production predicated on the extraction of surplus labor from an exploited working class, rooted in systems of private property. That's what capitalism is. When it can work with markets and democracy and free trade and liberty, it will do so, at least sometimes, but when push comes to shove and capitalists have to use the jackboot, or have to use weapons, or have to curtail basic human rights, or have to use captured markets, or have to use all sorts of policies that hurt the majority of people, they will do so, and they will do so readily and happily and with gusto. History has shown us this. The contemporary world has shown us this. So Charlie Kirk needs to realize, and all those who might listen to him need to realize, that capitalism, even under the most charitable interpretation, is an amoral system that requires external control to operate with any sense of basic human dignity in mind. And that at the worst, capitalism is an immoral system that looks to tear down all those other values that so many people deem essential to a fair and just society. That's why regulation at the very least is required, and that's why, in my view, in my personal view, capitalism needs to fall in favor of a system that prioritizes the democratic ownership, operation, and control of all major industry in the hands of either worker, community, cooperative, or public ownership. That's the solution.